Hello and welcome to the International News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Donicic. Now, before we begin, I want to remind you to like, comment, and subscribe and join our growing international community. Now, let's get right into our main story today, which again concerns Ukraine. Now, at the beginning of this week on Monday, we gave a report generally analyzing how we got to the current situation and crisis that is occurring between Russia and the US-led NATO allies. Yesterday, on Tuesday, we covered potential sanctions that could come from US allies and the United States and its allies if Russia were to invade Ukraine. Now, today, we're going to cover some basic facts that have been generally left out by the mainstream media regarding this conflict. Now, just to cover the basics of what is going on, Russia has amassed more than 100,000 troops very close to the borders of Ukraine. In response, the United States and the NATO North Atlantic Treaty Organization have mobilized. Warships have put 8,500 soldiers in the United States on high alert, and many other NATO allies have begun to send military aid to Ukraine. Now, in addition to Russia's initial response of amassing soldiers on the border of Ukraine and Russia, Russia has began to undertake many different war games, which are basically military fun practice that shows other rival countries how powerful and strong you are. Typically, they're a diplomatic tool used to create brinkmanship or to increase tensions. Now, let's get right into what has kind of been missed by the mainstream media. And, it's kind of unfortunate. The key factor that is actually causing this conflict is not talked about very often. Russia's demands. This is basically the fundamental disagreement that is occurring between the United States and its NATO allies and Russia that is causing this conflict over Ukraine. And it's unfortunate. We're going to go into more detail later. This is called the Ukraine crisis. But the reality is this is a crisis and a conflict between the West and Russia. Basically, what is starting all of this tension is the buildup of Russian troops. Now, Russia has stated that it is willing to remove these troops and that it is not planning to invade Ukraine and that the soldiers are only there for two reasons. Russia has made two key demands of the United States and of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Demand number one is that NATO completely bars any potential entry for Ukraine into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And demand number two is that NATO and the United States remove all soldiers and military operations from former Soviet bloc nations and Warsaw Pact countries that are currently in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, both of these key demands are non-starters, meaning they're completely non-negotiable for NATO and the United States. The first demand, to completely ban entry from Ukraine to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is something that is absolutely non-negotiable. NATO has never banned entry from any country into its organization. And fundamentally, no international organization bans entry for any country into their governmental organizations. Now, there are restrictions, okay, especially in terms of regional organizations or what are called supranations. For example, Ukraine will never be able to join the African Union because it's not in Africa, right? That's a fundamental regional organization. An interesting fact, once Morocco petitioned to join the European Union, but was turned down because it's not in Europe. Now, some fundamental things need to be made, but generally speaking, in international relations, no country, unless for regional reasons, is permanently barred from joining an international organization if its people want to. That's part of self-determination and sovereignty, two fundamental principles that were established following World War II. Now, demand number two, quite simply, NATO is not going to remove its soldiers from NATO territory. Now, going so far as to call these ultimatums would be inaccurate. In international relations, an ultimatum is, you do this or my country is going to do that. Now, there has been no ultimatum. Russia has stopped short of saying, if this is not done, we're going to invade Ukraine. And Russia has in fact stated that it has no plans of assaulting, invading, attacking, or annexing any territory of Ukraine. However, US leaders and NATO allies feel completely different, and they've begun massing their own troops close to Ukraine and providing military support for the nation. Now let's cover the other things that have not been paid attention to by the mainstream media. Number 2 is the fact that the Ukrainian leadership has actually been calling for calm and has stated that there is no need to panic and that a Russian invasion is not imminent. Ukraine's foreign minister has stated multiple times that in terms of the amount of soldiers and military equipment that Russia has amassed alongside the Russia-Ukraine border, there is not enough and the soldiers are not sufficient to launch a large-scale military action. Now, I do have to actually state that that is not accurate. Russia has amassed more than 100,000 troops, and that is more than enough to launch any large-scale military action on any country, okay? On any nation. And Ukraine is a nation of 44.1 million people. That's the last estimate based on the most recent census. It's more than enough, especially to invade the eastern portions of Ukraine, who have been facing separatist revolutions that have been backed by Russia since 2014 and since the annexation of Crimea. Now, the reason that they are doing this makes sense. Ukraine wants to present a picture of calm for its own citizens, to not create panic. As stated by Ukrainian foreign minister, Russia raising tensions is simply the end, and that it's not the means. Russia's goal is not to raise tensions and then invade. Russia's goal is just to raise tensions and divide the Western allies and divide NATO, and to scare these countries into submission and meeting their demands. Now, this is actually in diplomacy very common, and it's something we've covered multiple times on the show before regarding multiple issues, such as North Korea or what's been going on in Ethiopia or tensions in the Middle East. This is what's known as brinkmanship, or building up tension so high, making the tension so close to conflict that everyone thinks we're going to go to war soon. But the reality is that right in the last minute, negotiations are had where the party that raised these tensions is given favorable concessions. And brinkmanship was actually invented in the Cold War and frequently used by Russia and the United States to get concessions from one another. Now, we have to talk about other NATO allies. This is not just a conflict between the United States and Russia. Now, the Western world primarily is still led by the superpower of the United States, who maintains its dominance in the West. However, other Western countries are still extremely relevant, and they become much more assertive over the years than they were 20, 30, or 100 years ago. Now, the reality is that Germany has been criticized the most, and criticized the most heavily by other NATO allies, particularly Britain, for not doing enough. The United Kingdom, who has a special relationship with the United States and very close ties and is almost always having the US's back in any diplomatic disputes or international conflicts, has stated that every single member state of NATO needs to do more to support Ukraine. They need to be connected and they need to be united on the sanctions that they present against Russia economically. Now, sanctions, as we covered in our episode yesterday, and you can find that in our Europe playlist, could theoretically be more than enough to actually have Russia pull out of Ukraine if it did invade it. But in order for these sanctions to work, in order for them to be crippling enough for the Russian economy to send a message, they have to be united sanctions. The United States shutting off its economy or just shutting off the United States dollar to Russia is not enough. Russia's economy needs to be shut off from Europe and from the United States for these sanctions to be effective. Now, the UK has called on all NATO member states to take a more solidified front. And as I mentioned before, the nation that has been the most criticized for not taking a united front and not being on the same page as its other NATO member states and alliance members is Germany. And the reason why is actually, it makes a lot of sense. Germany has very close and very strong and very important economic ties to Russia, especially as they regard energy, particularly natural gas, which heats its citizens and the people that live in Germany. Now, Germany obviously has been putting its economic interests and national interests ahead of the foreign policy interests of other nations. But an argument needs to be made. Germany is a country in Europe, and Russia is a nation that is seeking to expand its sphere of influence. If Russia's sphere of influence is consolidated in the Ukraine, it is going to begin to move west towards former Warsaw Pact countries. We can expect the same type of situation, maybe not an invasion, but definitely the influence and pressure on countries like Poland that used to be under the Warsaw Pact to be influenced by Russia and to come under Russia's sphere of influence. And Germany can find itself back again on the Cold War border of being in the center of the United States Western-led sphere of influence and Russia's sphere of influence. Germany feels that its economic interests are more important, but the reality is its territorial integrity and national sovereignty can also potentially be at stake. And that considering the fact that it's a European country and a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and joining a military alliance like NATO have certain obligations, has to be prepared to make certain economic consolidations and begin to view Russia as a threat and not an economic partner. In Russia's defense, their foreign minister recently, their foreign minister Baerbock has stated that they are prepared to shut off the Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline if Russia invades Ukraine, and that they are prepared to enter unified sanctions with the United States. Now, Germany has also tried to kind of save face, but it's actually kind of been embarrassing. The German Minister of Defense, who I have to mention is a woman that only has a law degree and no military experience or qualifications to be the Minister of Defense. In my honest opinion, someone with no military experience should not be the Minister of Defense of any nation. But nonetheless, the German Minister of Defense is a lawyer. Now, the German Minister of Defense has committed 5,000 military helmets to the country of Ukraine, which is such a massive sign of support. And the German minister has stated that this is a symbol that shows that Germany has Ukraine's back and that they are unified. Now, the ambassador of Ukraine to Germany welcomed the helmets and said, thanks for the helmets. You know, they're helpful. Military helmets are pretty much glorified hats, but they are helpful and they are important. But the ambassador from Ukraine to Germany stated that this is only symbolic and that it's only a drop of water in the ocean. Germany needs to make stronger commitments if it wants to be allied with its fellow NATO member states and send a stronger message to Russia. And it's important that NATO is completely unified when it's entering this conflict with Russia, if it's going to escalate. Now, we also have to talk about the diplomatic talks that have been attempted so far to defuse this situation. They have been unsuccessful. But major diplomatic talks are still occurring, and a major diplomatic event is still going to happen this week. Now, I mentioned earlier Russia's demands. Demand number one, that NATO permanently bans the entry of Ukraine into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and demand number two, that NATO stops any form of military activity in former Soviet bloc countries. Now, the United States has publicly stated, alongside its NATO allies, that these demands are unacceptable and non-negotiable. But the United States is going to give a formal written response to President Vladimir Putin and the Federation of Russia. Now, I know this seems extremely boring and formal, and who gives a shit about a written response, but this is a part of international relations. Diplomatic steps need to be taken first before pragmatic or practical ones can be committed to. Now, this written response is going to be submitted by the United States to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Then Vladimir Putin is in turn going to make his own response. And that could lead to either an invasion or to a decrease in tensions or to just a basic increase in tensions and an increase in brinkmanship. We're not going to know until the letter is formally delivered and Vladimir Putin makes a response. Now, outside of the United States, NATO, and Russia, other diplomatic talks have been occurring, particularly in Paris. These talks have been attended by the leadership of Russia, Ukraine, Germany, and France. And the main goal is to establish peace and to establish boundaries between Ukraine and Russia and ensure that a conflict does not escalate. But the reality is, in almost every single diplomatic talk regarding this crisis that is occurring in Ukraine, the Ukrainians have been completely left out. The great powers of the United States and Russia are the ones with the strongest voice. And NATO allies like France and Germany and Britain have much more influence than Ukraine. And Ukraine has been completely pushed to the side. which is tragic because it's their country that is on the line, and it's their peace that's on the line, and it's almost ironic and hypocritical. Now, obviously, Russia wants to enter or consolidate power and sphere of influence in a nation that has determined publicly that it does not want to be a part of Russia. But the United States is stating that it is supporting Ukraine in its right of self-determination and sovereignty to join NATO. But at this point, it doesn't seem like it's supporting anything. It's not listening to Ukraine's voice, it's not listening to Ukraine's input, and it's not listening to Ukraine's attempts to calm down the situation and avoid war. Now, Ukraine does have a foreign policy interest and a foreign policy goal, an official one by its government, to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and has actually urged other NATO member states to urgently take its application into consideration and immediately make it a NATO member state. Nonetheless, this has transitioned slightly, and Ukrainian leadership has begun to just push for peace because it's their people and their lives that are on the line. Now, we're going to go to how religious leaders have been reacting to this situation, specifically Pope Francis, who today held a day-long prayer for peace in Ukraine. And Pope Francis ended this prayer by stating, "Please, no more war." That's an exact quote. Look, Francis, I'll tell you right now, that's probably not going to happen. Even if there is peace in Ukraine, the world will eventually face another war in another region. War is just, and conflict, a basic human instinct. War occurs. I was born in the middle of a war, and I hold no negative emotions or bad feelings towards the people who were attacking my city. That's the nature of human response and mass human politics. It's just a casualty that happens every single day. But I actually do agree with Pope Francis as it relates to Ukraine. In his prayer, Pope Francis stated that God should provide, that the interests of peace take precedent and take importance over the interests of specific political actors. And that message should actually maybe be listened to. Now, I understand that the United States wants to ensure and consolidate its sphere of influence, and Russia wants to do the same. Every single nation wants to do the same, and it has the absolute right to do so. Conflict in international relations is something that is unavoidable. Foreign policy and national interests occasionally, actually frequently collide, and that leads to conflict. Whether it's in the form of war or economic disputes or a trade war, that's just a reality that happens every single goddamn day. But it's actually really unfortunate when you look at this specific crisis, which everyone has called the Ukraine crisis. But it has nothing to do with Ukraine or the people of Ukraine. Ukraine is just a country of 44 million people who unfortunately happen to find themselves on the borders between the spheres of influence of two of the world's great powers, Russia and the United States. And for the people of Ukraine, specifically the people of eastern Ukraine, who have been fighting Russian separatists since 2014, all they want is peace. And what's even sadder is that when you look at the people of eastern Ukraine, who most likely, if Russia makes a territorial advancement on the nation, will be in the eastern region of Ukraine where there's already Russian separatist movements. Decisions that affect their lives have historically been made in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, which is far from the eastern region. But now, even worse, decisions that affect their lives and the possibility of peace are being made in capitals that have nothing to do with Ukraine. These decisions are being made in Paris, France. These decisions are being made in Washington, D.C. of the United States. These decisions are being made in Berlin, Germany. They are being made in London, the United Kingdom, and Moscow, Russia. They are not being made in Ukraine by Ukrainians. And everyday Ukrainians, whether they want to be a part of Russia or whether they want to be a part of Ukraine, all they want is peace. These are people that are trying to survive on a day-by-day basis. And the last thing that they need are bullets and bombs falling on their heads. And they have no right, they have no vote, and they have no voice, and they have become a victim of a geopolitical conflict that is occurring between two great powers. No matter who wins, whether it's NATO and the United States or Russia, who happens to consolidate its sphere of influence interest in Ukraine, there will be one loser. And that loser will be the people of Ukraine who did not want this conflict and only wanted peace and only wanted economic growth and development for their country and the right to self-determine and the right to sovereignty like every other modern day nation. Now, hopefully, war doesn't happen. And hopefully these people get to live their lives and their lives get better. Really, at the end of the day, that's the goal of all politics. I don't want to sound like some hippie promoting peace nonstop. I am a realist, and I understand that war is a natural occurrence that just happens every day. As I mentioned before, I was born in a war zone during the siege of Bihać in Bosnia and Herzegovina. That's actually what garnered my interest in politics and international relations while I was growing up. I hold no animosities towards the forces that were bombing my city. It was a political dispute, and those forces were only looking out for their own political interest. That's just a reality. But I also understand what it's like to not have your voice heard and wake up one day having bombs fall on your head and not knowing where they're coming from or who they're coming from. Let me know what you think. Comment on how you think the situation is going to play out. And before you leave, like and subscribe to our channel to join our growing international community. I like to hear your thoughts and I like to have a constructive debate. I'll see you next time.